In the forgotten corners of America's past, there are stories too unsettling to be written in school books. The year was 1851, a time when Virginia's rolling hills held plantations that concealed more than just crops and wealth. Behind shuttered windows and locked doors, families hid practices so disturbing that whispers alone could freeze the blood of those who heard them. Among these tales, one family's legacy still lingers in shadows: the Hendersons, whose name has become synonymous with terror. Their home, once a proud estate, became a site of unspeakable acts that blurred the lines between tradition, madness, and sin. Tonight, we reopen their story, not to glorify it, but to remind you of the darkest corners of human history where horror was not imagined but lived. The Henderson family's reputation in 1851 Virginia was one that commanded both admiration and envy. To neighbors and acquaintances, they were the picture of Southern refinement, wealthy landowners, deeply religious in appearance, and seemingly bound by a tradition of discipline and order. Their estate stood proud on rolling acres of land, its grand columns a statement of power and permanence, its windows shining like watchful eyes over the countryside. But appearances in those days often carried more weight than truth, and in the Hendersons' case, the truth was something far too grotesque to ever see daylight. Beneath the fine carriages and polished silverware, behind the lace curtains and Sunday sermons, was a legacy of depravity so deeply woven into their lives that even their closest servants could barely speak of it without trembling. They carried the family's name like a shackle, knowing what was whispered behind those thick walls was more than just scandal. It was a darkness that grew stronger with each passing season. The Hendersons operated their estate like a kingdom, one where every family member was subject to unwritten rules and customs that bound them in secrecy. To an outsider, their rules appeared as strict codes of morality, but within the family, morality had been inverted into something sinister. Their traditions were carried out with ceremony, as though they were rituals to be honored, and each new generation was expected to participate, willingly or not. To the Hendersons, what was horrific to the world was heritage to them. The mansion itself seemed to breathe with their corruption, its hallways long and echoing, its staircases creaking beneath hurried footsteps, its chambers filled with whispers that servants prayed not to hear. Every corner of the house carried a memory, and those memories were soaked in shadows. The servants, who lived under the constant gaze of their masters, knew more than anyone. They carried trays of food into locked rooms where the atmosphere was heavy with dread, and they carried out linens stained with secrets no amount of washing could cleanse. They dared not ask questions, for those who did were silenced swiftly, either dismissed into poverty or made to vanish without explanation. It was not unusual for a servant to disappear from the estate, their name never spoken again, their belongings discarded as though they had never existed. The surviving staff learned to lower their eyes and keep their tongues still, for their silence was their only protection. They spoke only in hushed tones among themselves, sharing fragments of what they had witnessed. Strange cries in the night, the sound of multiple voices raised in unnatural rhythms, and the haunting silence that followed, as though the house itself was swallowing the evidence of what had just taken place. The Henderson patriarch was a man who demanded obedience, not only from his children and his servants, but from the very walls of his estate. His commands were law, and no one within his reach dared to question him. Yet he was not the only orchestrator of the family's traditions. The matriarch, a woman outwardly pious and admired for her charity, was just as deeply embedded in the hidden practices. She upheld the family's secrecy with a cold and calculating devotion, her prayers at church masking the rituals she condoned at home. To outsiders, she was a woman of grace, but those who served her behind the walls of the mansion knew her as a watchful guardian of the family's most unspeakable acts. Every room in the Henderson estate carried an unspoken purpose. The parlor, where visitors were entertained with music and laughter, transformed into something else after the guests departed, its heavy drapes drawn tight to keep prying eyes away. The upstairs chambers, reserved for family, were forbidden to servants after dusk, though the sounds that drifted from them told more than sight ever could. The cellar, damp and windowless, was a place of particular dread. Servants who ventured too near whispered of hearing muffled screams, a sound that echoed in their minds long after they had fled the darkness below. It was as though the house itself had become a participant in the Hendersons' legacy, holding their secrets in its walls like a vault no one dared unlock. The younger members of the Henderson family, born into this cycle, had little chance of escape. From their earliest years, they were groomed to accept the practices as part of their bloodline, their innocence broken under the guise of family duty. What should have been bonds of love and protection became shackles of corruption, and those who resisted faced consequences that left scars not just on their bodies but on their very souls. Their laughter was forced, their smiles hollow, for they knew that the walls of the mansion did not allow for true joy. Every moment of tenderness was poisoned by the looming shadow of tradition, and every glance carried the weight of unspoken terror. Neighbors whispered of the Henderson children, noting their pale expressions, their distant eyes, their reluctance to mingle with others of their age. Yet none dared to voice their suspicions openly. The Henderson name carried too much weight in Virginia society, and accusing them of sin was as dangerous as it was futile. So the community turned a blind eye, convincing themselves that the rumors were exaggerations, that the strangeness of the Henderson family was little more than eccentricity born from wealth. But those who worked within the estate, those who carried the burden of knowledge, knew that the truth was far darker than any rumor dared to capture. The Henderson mansion stood tall in the light of day, but when night fell, it became something else entirely. Lanterns glowed behind drawn curtains, shadows moved across the walls, and muffled sounds drifted into the night air, reaching the ears of anyone brave enough to linger nearby. The locals avoided the estate after dark, their unease growing with every whispered story, their fear becoming part of the Henderson legacy itself. The family's reputation outwardly remained intact, yet the true nature of their practices seeped into the land around them, infecting every memory, every corner, and every heart that crossed their path without mercy. In the Virginia of 1851, society was built upon strict hierarchies where wealth and power determined not only a family's reputation, but also their ability to conceal the truth about what happened behind closed doors. The Henderson family understood this structure better than most and used it as both a shield and a weapon. Outwardly, they were the embodiment of Southern aristocracy, landowners with polished manners, a proud lineage, and influence that reached from courthouse steps to church pews. But beneath that polished image, they created a private world within their estate, a place where the boundaries of morality and decency were not merely ignored, but deliberately shattered. The Hendersons turned their privilege into a mask that allowed them to carry out grotesque practices in secret, all while ensuring that the outside world remained blind to the horrors occurring within their home. It began with control, the kind that seeped into every aspect of their lives. The Henderson patriarch used his wealth to silence suspicion, offering favors, debts, and influence to keep those around him pliant. If whispers arose, they were smothered with gifts or threats, depending on which the situation demanded. His power in the community was such that no accusation could stick to him, for judges and ministers alike relied on his favor. With that untouchable status, the family's house became a fortress where unspeakable acts could unfold without fear of intrusion. The neighbors saw only the elegance of their gatherings, the refinement of their attire, the respectability of their prayers, and they dared not peer deeper into the shadows. The family's private rituals grew in scope as the years passed, and by 1851 they had become carefully orchestrated spectacles. These were not moments of indulgence hidden away in secrecy, but elaborate events that blurred lines intentionally, designed to break innocence and ensure corruption was woven into the very fabric of the family's bloodline. What should have been sacred ties between kin were desecrated through repeated exposure to these horrors. Each generation taught that participation was not optional, but an essential duty. To the Hendersons, secrecy did not mean shame, it meant power. By ensuring that every member of the family shared in the corruption, they created a bond of silence that no one could ever betray. The shame was so complete, so total, that it became impossible for anyone within to speak of what they endured. Silence was not merely survival, it was inheritance. The children, born into privilege and expectation, were groomed from their earliest days to accept the twisted customs of their home. What they should have learned from scripture and moral teaching was replaced with lessons carefully twisted to justify the grotesque practices of their parents. Religious language was woven into their indoctrination, prayers recited before acts that corrupted rather than sanctified. By masking their horrors beneath the cloak of ritual and tradition, the Hendersons gave their children no room to resist. The act of questioning was painted as betrayal, and obedience was rewarded with survival, while defiance carried consequences so severe that no one dared attempt it twice. The servants of the house, trapped in a cycle of fear and dependence, saw these events unfold in fragments. They were ordered to prepare the house for gatherings, to light candles in rooms that would soon bear witness to acts they prayed not to hear. They washed linens, stained with evidence of nights they were forbidden to speak of, their hands trembling as they scrubbed, their minds weighed down by the things they tried to forget. Some whispered to each other in the dark, piecing together what they had seen, though none dared to share the full story aloud. Their silence was purchased with fear, fear of dismissal, of poverty, of vanishing entirely. For those who worked at the Henderson estate, there was no safe escape. Leaving meant losing everything, and speaking meant risking much worse. The wider community was not blind to the strangeness of the Hendersons, but the power of wealth kept their suspicions from ever reaching the surface. At Sunday services, the family sat proudly in the front pew, their children silent and obedient, their expressions carefully blank. Parishioners noted their odd detachment, but they excused it as discipline, never daring to imagine what kind of discipline it truly was. The patriarch's donations funded repairs to the church, his influence kept debtors afloat, and his alliances ensured that no one would ever accuse him of corruption. To challenge the Hendersons was to risk ruin, and so the community chose complicity through silence, pretending not to notice what their instincts told them. Within the Henderson estate, secrecy was cultivated like a crop, nurtured and harvested with precision. The rituals themselves served not only as acts of corruption but as tools of control. Each family member, each servant, each participant became trapped in the cycle of silence, their own shame binding them as effectively as chains. The genius of the Henderson system was that it left no one untouched. Everyone was either complicit or silenced, ensuring the truth could never reach beyond the walls. Those who knew too much became prisoners of their own knowledge, tormented by memories that could never be spoken. Those who knew too little simply vanished into the night, their names erased, their fates a warning to others. By 1851, the Henderson estate had become more than a home. It was a theater of shadows where secrecy reigned supreme. The grand facade hid layers of corruption, and the family moved within those layers with calculated ease, blending charm and cruelty until the two were indistinguishable. Outsiders saw only refinement, neighbors envied their wealth, and servants prayed for survival. But those within the family knew the truth. They knew the rituals were not indulgence, but inheritance, not weakness, but design, and that once bound to them, there was no escape. For the Hendersons, secrecy was both weapon and sanctuary, and their grotesque legacy grew stronger with every generation forced to carry it. Many families of Virginia in the mid-19th century clung to traditions that had been passed down for generations, traditions that blended faith, community, and family honor into something unshakable. Yet within the walls of the Henderson estate, those same traditions were twisted into something grotesque. The rituals that the Hendersons carried out bore the appearance of devotion on the surface, framed by prayers and scripture, but the words of the Bible were not spoken for salvation. They were recited like incantations to justify what was about to follow. To those born within the household, the rituals were presented as holy obligations, acts that preserved the sanctity of their lineage and bound them together in ways outsiders could never understand. What began with the sound of prayer often ended in something that desecrated the very idea of kinship, and those who were forced to endure it carried with them scars so deep that they could not find peace in faith again. The structure of these rituals was deliberate, crafted with the precision of someone who understood the power of appearances. They always began in a setting designed to mimic religious observance. Candles were lit not only for illumination, but for atmosphere. The soft glow meant to sanctify the room, and verses were read aloud in voices calm and reverent. The younger members of the family were made to kneel, their heads bowed, their innocence cloaked in a false sense of ceremony. To outsiders, had they been allowed to glimpse such moments, it might have looked like nothing more than a devout family honoring their faith. But when the prayers ended, the true horror began, and the sanctity of those words was immediately undone by what followed. It was in that transition from sacred to profane that the Hendersons' corruption revealed itself most clearly, for it was not indulgence alone that they sought, but the deliberate perversion of what was holy. The use of scripture was their shield, the verses twisted and reinterpreted to bind their victims in silence. To the children, the rituals were explained as commandments, obligations that proved their devotion not only to God, but to their family. Resistance was painted as sin, silence as virtue. The young ones, with no frame of reference beyond the confines of their estate, were trapped by this manipulation, convinced that what they endured was necessary, even righteous. Their minds were shaped in these moments, molded to accept the unacceptable, conditioned to mistake corruption for duty. In this way, the Hendersons did not simply break bodies, they broke spirits, ensuring that the cycle of secrecy and shame would never be interrupted. Those who lived to speak of it later, long after the family's legacy began to crumble, recalled these scenes with trembling voices. They described the chilling precision with which the rituals unfolded, how each step seemed rehearsed, practiced, as though it had been performed countless times before. They remembered the sound of voices rising together in prayer, only for those same voices to carry out acts that stripped the prayers of all meaning. They spoke of the candles flickering in heavy air, of the silence that followed, and of the weight of shame that hung over the room long after the ritual ended. Their testimonies were fragmented, spoken in whispers, but together they painted a picture too vivid to dismiss, a picture that revealed just how deeply the Hendersons had corrupted the very idea of tradition. The servants, always present at the margins, bore witness in silence. They were the ones who prepared the rooms beforehand, who lit the candles, who laid out the scriptures on polished tables, and who collected the remnants when it was over. Their hands trembled as they set each piece in place, for they knew what was coming, though they dared not speak of it aloud. They moved like shadows, silent, obedient, trying to block out the sounds that would follow. Many claimed later that they prayed under their breath as they worked, begging for forgiveness for even their indirect role in what the family commanded of them. Their fear was not only for their own souls, but for the souls of the children, whom they watched grow pale and hollow as the years passed. What made the Hendersons' rituals all the more horrifying was the intent behind them. These were not random acts of cruelty, not fleeting indulgences hidden in shame, but carefully cultivated traditions designed to destroy innocence and replace it with obedience. Each ritual was a test of loyalty, a reinforcement of silence, and a way of ensuring that no one within the family could ever speak out. By binding everyone in shared corruption, they ensured complicity, for who among them could expose the family without exposing themselves as well? The design was flawless in its cruelty, a legacy that could perpetuate itself without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The children bore the heaviest burden, their identities consumed by this twisted inheritance. Their laughter grew hollow, their smiles vanished, their eyes became vacant, as though their souls had retreated to escape the weight of what they endured. They moved through the estate like pale ghosts, shadows of what children should be, burdened with knowledge they could not understand yet could never escape. Their silence was not only forced, but internalized, a prison within their own minds that left them unable to imagine life beyond the Henderson estate. They were both victims and future participants, caught in a cycle from which there was no escape. Neighbors who occasionally saw the Henderson children noted their unusual quietness, their reluctance to play with others, their eyes that seemed to carry far more weight than any child should bear. But these observations were dismissed, attributed to strict parenting or the demands of wealth and discipline. No one allowed themselves to believe that the rituals spoken of in hushed rumors could truly exist. And so the cycle continued, protected by denial, by fear, and by the powerful influence the Henderson family wielded over their community. The rituals remained a secret legacy, hidden behind locked doors and shuttered windows, concealed beneath the facade of piety and refinement. They were the poison at the heart of the Henderson estate, rituals that grew more elaborate and binding with each passing year, consuming all who were forced to take part in them, leaving only hollow shells in their wake, bound in silence and shame that stretched far beyond their lifetimes. The community surrounding the Henderson estate was not entirely blind to the unsettling truths that lurked within its walls, for rumors have a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly secrets are sealed. Whispers drifted through taverns late at night, murmurs passed in hushed voices during church gatherings, stories carried between servants who dared share fragments of what they had seen. People spoke of the children's lifeless stares, of servants who disappeared without explanation, of strange cries that carried on the wind during nights when the lanterns in the Henderson windows burned too brightly and for far too long. Yet suspicion alone was never enough to break the family's iron grip, because the Hendersons were not only feared for what they might do within their home, but also for the power they wielded beyond it. Their reach extended through debt, favors, and influence, a network of control that ensured silence from those who might otherwise have dared to question them. Men in the nearby town owed their livelihoods to the Henderson patriarch, their land secured only through his loans, their businesses surviving only because of his patronage. To speak against him was to risk ruin, and so even those who suspected the truth bit their tongues and bowed their heads. Clergymen who should have condemned such darkness found themselves silent as well, their voices stilled by the knowledge that the Henderson family had funded church repairs, supported missions, and contributed to causes that gave them the appearance of virtue. To denounce the Hendersons publicly would be to undermine their own security, for they had accepted the family's gifts and were now bound by invisible chains of obligation. In such an environment, the truth was not only ignored, it was actively buried beneath layers of fear and complicity. The whispers grew louder over time, not because people suddenly found their courage, but because the evidence became harder to deny. Servants from the estate, when they dared to leave, carried with them haunted expressions and heavy silences. Some would never speak of what they had witnessed, but their fear alone told enough. Others, broken by what they had seen, shared fragments of stories with trusted confidants, fragments that painted a picture so grotesque that many listeners refused to believe them. It was easier to dismiss such tales as exaggeration than to face the possibility that beneath the grandeur of the Henderson estate lay horrors that defied morality. Denial became a shield for the community, a way of protecting themselves from truths they had neither the courage nor the power to confront. The Hendersons understood the value of that fear, and they cultivated it with precision. Those who whispered too loudly found themselves silenced, sometimes through threats, sometimes through consequences far more severe. A man who spoke in anger after too much drink was found beaten and broken at the edge of town, his warning clear to all who saw him. A servant girl who confided in a friend vanished overnight, her name never spoken again within the estate, her absence explained away with lies. Each incident served as a reminder that the Hendersons were untouchable, and that crossing them was not simply unwise, but dangerous. Over time, silence became less a choice and more a survival instinct, ingrained in the minds of everyone who lived within reach of their power. Tales of broken children lingered in the background of these whispers, stories of pale faces and hollow eyes, of young ones who walked through town with expressions far older than their years. Mothers clutched their own children tighter when they saw them, sensing something unnatural, though they never said the words aloud. Fathers who once considered alliances with the Henderson family thought twice, uneasy though they never admitted why. Yet the family's wealth and influence overshadowed every suspicion. The Henderson name was etched into property deeds, into church ledgers, into the very foundation of the community, and so no one dared to strip away the mask that hid their true nature. There were moments when the tension in the air seemed unbearable, when the weight of unspoken truths pressed down so heavily that even the most loyal members of the community questioned whether their silence was worth the cost. During storms, when the wind carried strange sounds from the estate, people sat in their homes with unease, unable to shake the thought that something unnatural was unfolding nearby. When another servant disappeared, the whispers grew louder, yet still no one acted. They told themselves that it was not their place, that the Hendersons were too powerful, that it was safer to remain silent and hope the darkness stayed confined within the estate's walls. But silence never truly contained the Hendersons' legacy, it only allowed it to grow. Every rumor ignored, every whisper left unspoken, gave the family greater freedom to continue their practices unchecked. Their control over the community was not only a matter of wealth, but of psychology, for they had convinced their neighbors that survival meant complicity. The community became their accomplice through inaction, bound not by blood, but by fear. And as the years passed, the whispers became part of the very fabric of local life, a background noise that everyone heard but no one dared acknowledge. Those who dared to look too closely at the Henderson estate often described the feeling of being watched, of the windows glaring down at them like eyes that knew their secrets. The land itself seemed tainted, the silence around the property heavier than the silence of ordinary countryside. Travelers passing through avoided the area after nightfall, their unease palpable though they could not explain it. Locals told them it was foolish superstition, yet even they kept their distance, wary of drawing the attention of a family whose power seemed to stretch beyond reason. The Hendersons thrived in that silence, their influence feeding off it, their legacy preserved not through pride, but through fear. And so the community, bound by obligation, by terror, and by their own willful blindness, became complicit in the Hendersons' secrets, their whispered stories echoing in taverns and churchyards but never reaching beyond, never spoken aloud where they might carry weight, their silence serving as the shield that allowed the family's horrors to continue unchecked. By the year 1851, the Henderson home had ceased to be a place of safety or kinship, and instead had transformed into a prison of horrors for those unfortunate enough to live within its walls. The grandeur of its facade, with its towering white columns and sweeping verandas, disguised the suffocating darkness that lurked inside. To the eyes of a visitor, it was a proud Virginian estate, carefully manicured and glittering with wealth, but to those who knew its secrets, it was a place of torment, where silence and obedience were the only shields against the family's escalating corruption. Every wall, every hallway, and every locked chamber became part of an elaborate trap that ensured no escape, a labyrinth of secrecy where the victims were not only bound by fear, but by the family's deliberate intent to erase all sense of innocence. As the Henderson practices grew more grotesque, the very structure of the family itself began to warp. Bloodlines, once a sacred marker of legacy and heritage, blurred beyond recognition. The boundaries that defined kinship in ordinary households no longer existed within theirs, for each generation was groomed to continue the cycle, each child raised not with protection, but with indoctrination. Those who should have been nurtured were instead broken, and those who should have been protectors became enforcers of the family's twisted creed. The family tree did not branch naturally, but folded inward upon itself, binding its members together in a suffocating knot of secrecy and shame. The further this cycle went on, the more the children became prisoners of an inheritance they never chose, carrying with them not only physical scars, but a legacy of silence that stretched across years like an unbreakable chain. The consequences of this corruption were written on the faces of those who lived through it. The servants, already haunted by the fragments they witnessed, carried out their duties in dread, their eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. But it was the children who bore the deepest wounds, their identities fractured before they even had the chance to form. Some moved through the house like hollow shells, their voices reduced to whispers, their laughter gone as if stolen from them. Others became mirrors of the very cruelty they endured, lashing out in small, desperate ways, repeating what had been forced upon them as if unable to separate themselves from the darkness in which they were raised. It was not only bodies that were harmed, but minds, twisted until the very idea of love or trust became foreign. The Henderson name became not an honor, but a curse, binding each generation to an inheritance of suffering. The few who survived with enough will to resist were often silenced by fear. To speak against the Henderson family meant exposing oneself to dangers far greater than shame. It meant risking not only ostracism but retribution, for the patriarch's influence reached well beyond the estate's walls. Families who owed debts to the Hendersons would not take in a runaway child, neighbors who relied on their patronage would not dare to listen, and even church leaders, tied to the family through donations and obligations, turned their eyes away. Survivors were forced to carry their pain in silence, their trauma buried so deeply that it became part of their very being. The Henderson home was not just a prison in stone and mortar, it was a prison of memory, one that lived inside those who endured it long after they walked its halls. As the horrors escalated, the house itself seemed to take on the weight of the family's sins. The rooms grew colder, the air heavier, as though the estate had absorbed the corruption of its inhabitants. Servants spoke of footsteps echoing through empty corridors, of voices carried on drafts from rooms that were locked and sealed, of shadows lingering where no person stood. The mansion had become more than a home. It had become a tomb of innocence, its very structure bound to the grotesque acts it concealed. Those who entered felt its oppressive atmosphere immediately, an invisible force that pressed on their chests and silenced their tongues. For outsiders, it was unease. For those trapped within, it was despair. The family's escalating practices ensured that no clear lines remained between victim and participant. Children raised in horror grew into adults who were expected to perpetuate it, and in their brokenness, many did. The cycle was self-sustaining, a living curse that bound each generation more tightly than the last. Any chance at escape was crushed before it could bloom, any flicker of defiance extinguished beneath layers of fear and manipulation. The Hendersons had succeeded in creating a system where corruption became heritage, where silence was loyalty, and where even the blood running through their veins carried the weight of their sins. The stories of those who survived tell of scars too deep to heal, wounds that festered long after the physical bruises had faded. Some spoke only in fragments, their voices trembling as they recalled nights filled with muffled cries and days where the silence felt heavier than stone. Others never spoke at all, their silence purchased not with money but with terror. They lived with the knowledge that even if they escaped the estate, they could never escape the legacy of their blood. It followed them like a shadow, a constant reminder that the Henderson curse was not bound by walls or land, but by memory and shame. The Henderson home stood as both fortress and prison, its doors keeping the world out while trapping its victims within. By 1851, it was no longer simply a family estate. It was a monument to suffering, its foundations cemented with secrecy, its halls echoing with voices long silenced, its legacy preserved in the fear of those who had no choice but to endure. And though the world outside saw only wealth and refinement, within its walls the truth lived on, a truth written not in ink, but in blood and silence, carried forward by those broken souls who bore its weight with every breath they took.